Thank you very much for coming this evening to the session, which intends to look at the housing options facing the major parties in the run-up to the election, and indeed the challenges they will face afterwards for whoever wins. I'm Kate Allen from the Financial Times. I'm the Financial Times property correspondent. I'm joined on stage by Charles Goodhart, who is a professor at the LSE's Financial Markets Group. He was a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Nancy Holman is an associate professor in the LSE Department of Geography and the Environment. Her research interests include housing and the planning system. Anne Power is a professor in the LSE's Department of Social Policy. She is also a national expert in housing, community development and urban development. And Christine Whitehead, who is a professor of housing economics at LSE and has had long involvement with academic and governmental research into housing issues. What we're going to do is we're going to start off with each person making a few short remarks, 5 to 7 minutes, about their specialist subjects, and then we will kind of open it up to questions from the floor. There are roving recorders which are going around, and if you wish to ask a question, please stick your hand up, and then if you get picked, please wait for the recorder before you start speaking, so we can all make sure we capture your question. I believe that Charles is going to start us off with the big picture macro look.
Thank you very much. I must say I find it rather refreshing to be the token male on this particular podium.
We aimed at it.
So often in economics it's the other way around. Now, the two main issues I think that will be part of the political campaign will be which party can promise to provide the largest supply of new housing, particularly affordable new housing. And the second main issue, I think, will be the question of what will be the form and changes to the taxation of property in general. But I hope I will have time to come back to these very briefly, but I want to start with another area which is less likely to form a subject for political discussion, but in my view, I wish that it would. And that is the interaction between finance and housing. I've now lived through 3 financial crises in the UK, 73, 75, 1992, and 2008, 2009. And all of these were caused by an interaction between a very large-scale credit expansion by the banking sector and a housing boom followed by a housing bust. Now, in the aftermath, particularly of the last 2008, 2009, there's been an enormous amount of attention paid to the regulatory reform of the banking system. But there's been virtually no attention paid to the degree of regulatory reform of housing finance, and particularly the possibility of trying to get a larger equity element into housing finance rather than a debt element. You will, of course, have noted that each of these combined banking and housing crises were 17 years apart. Now, we economists tend to forecast on the basis of assuming that you can extrapolate the past into the future, which means that I can predict with great confidence that the next housing banking finance crisis will take place in 2025. So watch out for that particular date. Now, despite the fact that there's been most focus on banking reform rather than the reform of housing finance, there has, however, been some movement. In particular, the government's Help to Buy measures, particularly their equity support measure, Help to Buy 1, did move the compass slightly towards a shift towards equity finance rather than pure debt finance. And for that kind of reason, actually, I personally tended to welcome it. In addition to that, the price effects on housing, which began to come through in recent years, have been dampened by the actions of the Financial Policy Committee. The introduction of them mortgage market review and the recent constraint on banks offering more than a certain percentage of high loan-to-income mortgages. And that will continue. And one of the issues that will occur in the next after the next election will be how the next government interacts with the FPC in terms of the effects on housing prices and the state of the housing market altogether. But as a generality, one of the regrets that I really have about the aftermath of the latest crisis was being how little change has been to the structure of housing finance. And I think a lot more could be done. However, let me end by going back again rather briefly to the two issues which will play a significant role in the upcoming election. The first is which party can promise credibly to increase the supply of new, particularly affordable housing most. And this, of course, relates to issues like planning provisions. The major big housing construction companies actually have quite large land banks. But one of the problems that they feel is that they are concerned with the steadiness. They don't want boom bust. What they want is to be able to construct new houses steadily over the foreseeable future. So they will tend to look at pressures from the government, any government, to ask them to use up their land bank quickly, to construct a lot of new houses very quickly. They will look at those kind of pressures with very considerable caution and doubt. Then there is the question of property taxation. Most of us are aware of the increasing concern about inequality. Thomas Piketty's book, and a great deal of the increasing inequality in almost all our countries, certainly including the UK, has arisen from the massive increase in the valuation of prime urban property. And the combination of the still very large deficits that this country is running, the considerable attractions of taxing property because it is inelastic, you can't move it away, and the concern about inequality and all of that means that there are bound to be considerations about how property should bear a share, probably an increasing share, of the tax burden over in future years. And there have been a whole series of moves in that direction. As you know, the Conservatives shifted the form of stamp duty very recently. The Labour Party have been suggesting, as indeed the Liberal Party as well, Liberal Democrats, a mansion tax. Whereas I tend to think that one of the things that we ought to renew is the old Henry George taxation on land, the taxation of land use values. But all of those issues, I think, are likely to come up increasingly over the course of the next 5 years and are likely to play some role, as they already have done, in the forthcoming election. So those are the two areas, the provision of increasing supply and the taxation of property values, that I think are going to be the main elements in the run-up to the general election in this particular field.
Thank you very much, Charles. That leads us very, very nicely into Christine Whitehead's specialist subject field. So, Christine, would you like to pick up from there?
Thank you very much. Yes, numbers. The general view in the media and elsewhere, I think, is that housing is in a crisis, that housing crisis can only be solved by numbers, and that it is one of the highest priorities looking to the election. The evidence, unhappily, is that the fact that we think it is a high priority does not mean we vote on that basis. And therefore, although there is a great deal of discussion going on at the present time, the expectation should be very much lower than the aspirations which are currently being put around. So votes don't follow because the vast majority of us, not perhaps the vast majority of this audience, but the vast majority overall, are reasonably well housed at reasonably affordable prices because we've been in it some time. But promises work, but promises have to be fulfilled if they continue to work. If we go back a very long time, which half a dozen of people in the audience can, to the late 1960s, the Macmillan promises of 300,000, etc., there were competitive promises in those days, were met. The numbers were achieved. And indeed, I spent a little bit of my time in the early 1970s saying we don't just want numbers. We now have no shortage, direct numerical shortage, so we need to worry about other things. So it was interesting, of course, when we came around to 2007, and Gordon Brown's promise was 3 million by 2020. In other words, a much, much longer period. And of course the financial crisis came, and we're just over 1 million in 2015, and we're not going to make the other 2 million by 2020. The current promises are varied, and they depend upon when they've been made. So Miliband's promise is last year. It already looks very out of date in some ways. It's promised 200,000 in 2020, but how much before that is not at all clear. That is still 50,000 below what most commentators think is actually necessary. It's probably significantly above what we can actually achieve on a regular basis. We can do it for 1 year. We might even, in the 3-month period, look as though we're doing it in 2015. But to do it year on year is really significantly difficult. The Lib Dems promise is 300,000, with absolutely nothing behind where it's coming from. The Greens is 500,000 social housings over a 5-year period. You may not know what it was, but that's what it says. And the Conservatives one is around the issue of 200,000 starter homes, a word term which we've seen many times before, with at least some statement about where the land is coming from and where the funding is coming from. We may not like those statements, but at least it's got more practicability. But it's still very unlikely to be met. So does it matter? Promises the first time, and competitive promises is what it's fundamentally about. We are currently producing maybe 125,000. These are all suggesting more than doubling that. And I think one of the issues in this context is that the OBR, which has to estimate the amounts expected through to 2018, suggests that we have not the slightest chance of meeting those, and that if we did, we would be starting to distort the macroeconomy really quite badly. So there are real concerns, but numbers is going to be the issue for at least the next couple, how long have we got to go? Next couple of months, but it may be migration that people will pull back from some of the numbers which they have suggested. I think the second issue, which links again with what Charles has already said, is bringing in equity, and in particular bringing in institutional investment into the system. And that means significantly foreign money, but foreign money to help development and to expand output, not necessarily foreign money for buying. But these two things are very entangled in the political discussion, and there's a lot of difficulties around that. The issues, I think, with institutional investment is that this is going to go mainly into very large sites in London and maybe in Manchester and one or two other places. But what it will develop will be for particular types of household. It will be at the luxury end of the market. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want them, but it does mean we do need houses of all types at the moment, and we certainly need good flats, and we need professional management. And these new equity investors have a chance of bringing this forward. So that is an area for significant discussion at the moment. But the other side of that, and going back here not just to the Labour Party, although the Labour Party is much clearer about what they want to do, is the idea of rent stabilisation or ultimately rent control. Now, that term tends to terrify people, not necessarily because what the outcome would be lower rents or lower returns, but more because it adds another uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen. What we might put in place at the very beginning might look very sensible, stabilising rents over a 3-year period in relationship to an index, giving people more security of tenure, seems entirely rational, I suspect, to many of the people in this room and to many people outside. But you then look at what's happening in Germany, where that has been the system for many years, and what is happening now is rent control. We want to hold rents down because of the tensions in the system. So institutional investors, foreign investors, the people who are likely to bring the money forward are significantly being affected, not necessarily by the content of the regulatory changes, but by the fears that there will be further things to follow. But the final point I would like to make in this context, having made, I hope, the point about we need confidence and stability in the system, so what we'd really like is the economy to work well and then housing will work better, is about housing and welfare. Over half of the income of housing associations comes from housing benefit. In other words, the state pays the rents of equal to over half of the revenues. If we are trying, as the government and the opposition are trying to do, to stabilise the amount of funding, then we are starting to look at cutbacks in the welfare cap and other factors which will affect housing associations' income, housing associations' capacity to provide affordable housing, and the financial institutions' preparedness to pay for that. On the other side of that is that with so many people on housing benefit, partial or full, in both the social sector and the private rented sector, we have really major issues associated with the impact of housing benefit on the incentive to work and the capacity to get anything out of that work. So there are masses of areas where housing is going to be in the news, but it won't be the thing which will change the election.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christine. Now, moving on to the planning system, Nancy is going to address that issue.
Okay. First, let me just say that I start this off now having been incredibly depressed by both Charles and Christine, not for the reason you think, but because I too have lived through 3 financial crises, and I also remember Macmillan just at the tail end there. So I feel somewhat older than I should, I feel somehow. I think it's actually really interesting to sit on a panel with 2 economists and a housing and environmental person and a planner, because I think we all basically agree that there is some level of problem with the housing system and the fact that we're not building the housing numbers that we need to and that we should. I probably imagine that we disagree slightly on some of the solutions and maybe some of the causes of the problem, but I will go forward and put out a couple of ideas that I think might be helpful, but with the knowledge that I've got 2 economists sitting to the right of me and I may be shot down terribly in the end. So, thank you, Anne. Solidarity. So, I think if we think about the problems that we currently face in terms of housing and in terms of planning in the UK, The first is that we have an incredibly sensitive housing system. The housing market is actually quite sensitive to shocks from external sources and economic instability. A really simple example of this is if housing finance dries up, then house builders tend to slow down and stop building, and then there's not enough supply. When money becomes more readily available, house builders ramp up their building, and you have things like shortages of labor and famously shortages of bricks. So we tend to have a very difficult insensitive system. We also have a very complex system of delivering housing and a really quite complex planning system in many respects. And while it allows for a lot of flexibility, which can be actually very helpful, it also means things like density and things like affordable housing targets are negotiable. And whilst in many respects that sounds great, because you have this vision of the planner sitting and negotiating on an even and great playing field with the developer, the reality of that is that developers feel that the price of the land can always kind of go up because they might be able to win a little bit more density or reduce their target on affordability just a little bit and increase therefore the profitability. And so in that game, power wins, and often you have very unequal sorts of power relationships between planners and developers. And that actually makes for an unstable land market, and prices of land kind of go up in that sense. And so that's actually a really difficult situation. And I think also one of the bigger problems that we're facing at the moment, if you look back at the housing numbers, so what Christine was talking about just a moment ago, when people were bandying about, we're going to build 300,000 homes, and they actually did it. If you look back to the 50s and the 60s, you had a great deal of public sector building. So what you see now is a fairly even kind of graph on the private sector that doesn't look that different than it did in the 50s and 60s, but what you're missing is the top tranche of all of the public sector building that happened in that time period. And what helped us get to 300,000 homes in a year was the fact that the state was building homes. Local authorities had land, local authorities gave themselves planning permission, and local authorities were able to build. And that actually added really significantly to the number of households, or the housing numbers that were actually built at the time. And I think having seen that drop off to having only really private sector and some housing association at the top of that, we've seen a really significant lack of housing numbers happening. And that's problematic. So I think if I were to try to give some suggestions to whatever future government was coming in, I think what I would tend to try to do is to tell them that they need to think about this in its complexity. They need to not go for just single measures. It's no good to say we're going to build 300,000 homes and they're going to be garden cities, but not give us any idea of how you're going to fund them, where they're going to be, how the infrastructure is going to come about. Those need to be thought through, and they can be thought through, but that can be one part of a package. It can't be the entirety. It's great to talk about starter homes, but we also have to think about what that means in terms of, are they talking about completely getting rid of Section 106 or planning gain within that? Not quite clear what they are talking about. And also this issue of it being on industrial land, redundant industrial land, or redundant commercial land. I think we need to consider that actually we need to have a balanced economy within cities. We do need to have industrial land, we do need to have commercial land, we do need to ensure that we're not just saying, oh God, housing is an issue, so let's go and build on this, all guns ahead. We need to actually think that through. So the first thing would be to try to think about this in the round and to actually then put together a number of policies that work together. I think some of the things that the government is currently doing that's quite helpful and that they might want to consider continuing are things like home zones, which help developers and planning authorities where there was already some level of synergy there to work together to bring forward new housing sites or to bring forward really more existing housing sites that are there. with kind of loans from central government in terms of infrastructure, because we have to think about infrastructure planning if we think about planning for homes. You can't have one without the other. I think that we need to really stop tinkering around the edges of the planning system. I think we keep reforming planning, and we have reformed planning now, in my living memory, a whole lot, so we're not going to go back to that. But just since 2004, we've had a lot of planning reviews and root and branch changes of the planning system, which never embed, which never get any time to settle down, which increase uncertainty in the system, which increase kind of this notion of, well, who knows where we are in space and time, and that uncertainty only leads to fewer houses being built and fewer permissions happening. We also don't invest in planning and planners often, so we're outsourcing, we're having fewer well-sourced planning departments, and in some respects it's no wonder decisions are taking longer, because there are fewer people to actually make the decisions, and there's less institutional memory within the planning departments as well. It's really important to build up a good service and to have a good service. And that's not just coming from me as a planner, but that's also, I promise, it's also coming from developers who say, actually, rather than denigrating planning, we actually need to support planners because they do an actually important job for us. So I think those are probably some things that are fairly easy and would not cause too many fears amongst my colleagues. The other thing that I think is an interesting suggestion was made by Shelter in a 2013 report, I think, and that was also about trying to get the state back involved in building, and that was a suggestion to invest 1% of GDP over 4 years to actually fund, they reckoned, around 50,000 homes in that way. Their argument for doing this sort of very Keynesian kind of development would be that actually for every pound that is invested in housing, you roughly get back £2.09 in terms of economic output. So as well, if you look back to the post-war period, a lot of the house building and a lot of the economic recovery that was seen just post-war was also because we were building homes. Those homes were being, people were actually working to build them, people were therefore paying tax, people were using bricks from the UK, the money was being rechurned into the economy. And while that might be a little bit too left-wing, I don't think that's the worst idea in the world. So I will leave it at that and then get killed in a minute.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. And now finally, Anne is going to talk about issues of regeneration and energy and environmental sustainability, I think.
Well, I decided while I was listening to everybody else that I'd better pretend I am the government, and I've just come in. So there's 4 things that I would really give very high priority to. The first is the scale and supply of social housing and how it can be funded. I think we're incredibly stupid in this country. We actually built the largest, among the largest supplies of social housing among European countries, and we so disrespect it, we so don't care about it, that we think the people who live in it actually are movable and it's very easy to demolish. In fact, that problem is catching up with us. The government is facing really serious protests around all sorts of schemes all over London. Developers are getting into a lot of trouble. We've already had the whole problem across the north with the Housing Market Renewal Programme, which effectively was going to wipe out up to maybe 500,000 properties on the same sort of basis. So one definite big must for the new government is to really question all demolition unless there are major structural issues, not repair issues, not reinvestment issues, not upgrading issues, not retrofitting issues, not the balance of probabilities, not this is a bad community, not this is a high crime area. None of that actually justifies demolition in the current situation. That's the first point. Linked to that is that new build housing, even of the cheapest kind, is almost never cheaper than retrofitting the most run-down estate, in my experience, and I do have a lot of experience of that. And it's also rarely affordable for low-income households. We do have about 20% of the population living below the poverty line, and we do have a serious problem of falling wages at the bottom, and we do have a really serious benefit problem, as people have suggested, and we can't just pick up the cost of new so-called affordable housing through the benefit system, because that's exactly what the government is trying to defeat. So if we actually think we should at least have the housing to house people, that's a conundrum which we have to escape, and one of the easiest ways of escaping it is not to demolish. We've just done some work on a high-rise estate in Hammersmith showing exactly that. 100% council owned, 100% poor, 100% concrete built in the 1960s can be turned into a really attractive and viable place without getting rid of a single tenant, and bit by bit actually increasing what you can add on around the bottom. So roughly for an estate of 1,000 properties, you can usually add without any difficulty about 500 additional properties, which can be affordable, or they can be actually middle market, or they can even be slightly higher market, although Hammersmith found it very difficult, having built very high market properties on the 24th floor of these 23-storey tower blocks, to work out what to do about the lifts, because they were shared with all the other floors. Anyway, what I would do alongside that is I would change the council tax band system. There have now been several really major articles and studies by very clever people about how stupid the current tax band system is, and if we could only convert Ed Balls' mansion tax into, I think Charles might have argued this, but I wouldn't swear to it, into a more sensible council tax band system, we could actually increase the flow of money, but much more importantly, we could decrease the level of under-occupation, and we could decrease the incentives to own more housing than you need. An awful lot of the housing crisis that we call the housing crisis is driven by really vast levels of under-occupation and a very fast acceleration in under-occupation too. All of that has a big knock-on effect on private renting, so I'd like to sign up to Christine's proposals on that, and unless we tackle private renting, which the government does know, then one, its bills are too high, two, the level of insecurity is too high, three, the reliance on private renting as a substitute for social housing will continue to grow, which knocks straight on into homelessness and all sorts of other problems over standards and social consequences for families with children and so on. So really, tackling the social housing problem has a big set of ramifications across the housing market. If you put private renting and social together, then you are talking about nearly half of the housing market, not quite. The second issue, I'm not going to talk about planning, only to say that we should protect green belts. Green belts are there not just to stop the sprawl of cities, and that's for a very good reason, because the sprawl of cities is incredibly damaging to cities. It's also damaging to the next nearby towns, but most importantly now, because of our environmental constraints, we have no choice but to protect the green belts. The green belts soak up all that flood water that doesn't hit London. I know enough of it does hit London, but if all of it hit London, and the same applies to all our other cities. So green belts, that's just a quick shorthand on why we need green belts. Green belts are not there only to provide pretty parks, which is why when people say, oh, it's all monoculture agriculture, or it's all scrapland, and why not build on it anyway, I think, why don't you understand that green belts have a more important function? They also drive urban density. So whereas we have increasing numbers of households, and in London we just managed to creep up to pre-war densities, if you look at the maps, we still have whole huge tranches of all our cities which are extremely low density, and also have a huge volume of small and large infill sites, which would produce, Savills just produced a report on this precisely, showing how the smaller and larger sites that are available already would produce immediately 2 million homes. Obviously, it would take a while to build on them. And we mustn't forget within planning that we are a very crowded country. We are the top most densely occupied country in Europe, along with Holland. We're the 6th most densely populated country in the world. I know people are sick of hearing me say that. But you can't be a densely populated country and not have a planning system. If we compared ourselves with Holland, which is equivalent density, we would think our planning system was weak-kneed, pathetic, useless. You know, we talk about planning constraints. Go to Holland and try and lift a finger. So really, with our density problems and with our overbuild problems and with our long urban record, we're a bit stuck on that. Let me just quickly say something about regeneration, what's called regeneration. We are stuck with protests all over the country about regeneration. It does have very high environmental costs and very high social costs, neither of which are currently costed into the model. It also has very high time lag costs, and it has huge social disruption and social network destruction costs. And unless we factor those things in, regeneration is going to evoke greater and greater protest for exactly the reasons I've said: the loss of social housing, and the crowded country that we're in. And therefore, the only way to make regeneration work, in my view, and there are examples of this, is to take a very long-term view, which of course is incredibly unpopular with the politics of housing. You know, we've had the discussion about the politics of housing. It's a ding-dong game. In France and Germany, there's a kind of consensus that you don't make housing the ding-dong game, because actually housing is a long-term thing. And if you do make it a political ball game, then you're stuck. You do bad decisions, you build badly, you build in the wrong places, and you go through these ups and downs. So regeneration is the perfect example of where we could take a long-term view. If we focused on upgrade first, infill second, and then let's see what we do if we're stuck, then we would actually find a much more rational system, I think. And I have got estate examples and no time to mention them. I'll only say that if you try to do any of this without community involvement, you will get community protest. And there are already lots of signs of that. On the other hand, if you do it with community involvement and you genuinely go in to try and broker a deal, you can actually find more sensible ways forward. You won't find the solution that will suit maximising profit, because there is a large, as somebody once described, I think possibly from the Financial Times, a large wall of money coming at this country wanting to buy our property. So you can't look at maximising profit and expect community involvement to stand up. So you're either going to create community subjection or community oppression or community brokering that actually turns out not to be worth the paper it's written on, or you simply say, actually, we do have a political responsibility to our electorate. Let's actually broker this differently, and let's see what we can do about coping with the wall of money in order to actually produce a better deal for communities.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. I like this idea of saying... I think you've just won the election. I like this idea of saying, well, we are in government now, so what is our policy? In that, before I throw it open to the floor, I'd like to ask a question of my own to the four panellists. Now that we are in government, I think that we need to philosophically stand back and decide what our primary objective with the housing system is. For the last decade now, home ownership levels have been falling. We're facing a generation the whole generation rent narrative, a generation who cannot get onto the housing ladder and are finding it increasingly difficult to do so. And yet we have come up with, the previous governments have come up with attempt after attempt to subsidise home ownership and shovel more people onto the bottom end of the housing ladder. Do we as a government think that home ownership is our primary purpose in our housing policy? Any of the four of you want to comment on that at all?
There are many other countries in which there's a much higher degree of renting, and I don't think there's any objection to that. I think the problem that we have now is not so much that people are in rental accommodation, but that people can't find any accommodation and they're living at home. So it's the sort of the 20s to 35s who are living at home and would like to be on their own, don't want to be with their parents, that I think it's what we need to deal with.
Well, and also you have people in very unstable situations in terms of rent. It's not like other countries where you have some level of stability, some level of longevity in your rented accommodation. If you're in a 6-month tenancy and that can be broken very quickly and very easily, and your rents can go up and up and up, and you end up having to live with 18 of your friends in a 2-bedroom flat in order to make ends meet, that's not a long-term situation. It's not viable.
I don't think that owner-occupation should be the primary purpose of the next government, for all sorts of good reasons about the shortages of funding, etc. I do think that in the longer term, we are probably a little bit below an optimal owner-occupied sector. We're now at about 65%, 64%, and the average in the EU is higher than that, even with all these countries with very large rental sectors. And in Germany and Switzerland, which are the ones which are always told we're doing only renting, they've got rapidly growing owner-occupied sectors at the present time in fairly stable things. As a government, remembering that I'm going to have to pay for those who are in the rented sector when they're elderly, I really want people in owner-occupation. That may not be the best thing for them, but it's certainly the best thing for the government if, as a result of it, people are able to pay for their much lower housing costs and retirement. So from a point of view of governments, there's no doubt that owner-occupation is a major necessity.
Anne, do you have any thoughts on the desirability of owner occupation?
Well, I definitely wouldn't have it as a core goal, and we do have to sort out the renting system, as both Christine said and I endorsed, and there are very basic ways of doing that. And although it's true that in Germany and Switzerland owner occupation is rising, they do have a vast renting base. So, you know, when you're near 60% renting and you start to eat into that with owner occupation, that's one thing. When you're much, much lower than that, it's a completely other. And obviously in Europe, you've got this extreme split. So Spain is 85% owner occupation, but 1 million repossessed properties. And nobody's allowed to rent them. So, you know, talk about returning home, that's really a big problem in Spain. One thing I didn't mention, well, various things. One is that older owner-occupiers, I see the logic of Christine's point, but older owner-occupiers are fine until they get frail elderly and until they're isolated because the rest of their family have moved too far away and they no longer can reach doctors, shops or anything without driving, etc., and have too big a garden. You know, I mean, there are loads of locked-in problems to the kind of owner-occupied housing that we've already got and to the kind of owner-occupied housing that old people get stranded in and not only become isolated in but actually can't sustain. So that's a really big issue, and the cost to the government, the long-term cost to the government of the care that goes into actually then creating a different housing and care system for that increasingly large band of the population is huge. So I think we'd be slightly out of the frying pan into the fire on that. And as far as younger people are concerned, we do have to remember people partner later, people have children later, people marry later. The whole sort of band of settling down has moved many years forward, and we haven't really allowed for that in our thinking. And people do have this terror of not being able to get onto the property ladder, which I understand because of this massive escalation in cost and because of the insecurity of private renting. So you've got this kind of lock-in to lots of elements of the housing system that aren't working very well. And unlocking them is pretty difficult, but it won't happen through just supply. Countries like the United States and Australia, where they've got loads more land than us and where they push supply, they've also created massive affordability problems and lockout problems and homelessness problems because of the problems of sustaining owner occupation and the lack of adequate renting. So I just think we should look to Europe, and we should look at some combination of the best that works in Europe. I think in Germany, Christine, a very, very large proportion of old people become owner-occupiers. If I remember seeing the figures, it's quite staggeringly large. So it seems to me gently easing people into owner-occupation as they go up the age ladder is probably a very sensible solution.
Though you did raise some of the issues.
Well, obviously then there are longer-term issues.
That is true. But if you look, we did work a long while ago, but I think you find it the same thing. If you took the sort of typical traditional middle-aged family across Europe, across Japan, everywhere else, they were all fundamentally in owner-occupation, 80% plus 45. But indeed, if you don't have to put them there at 30 when they're not settled.
Okay, let's throw it open to the floor. There's a gentleman here down the front, I think, with a question. If we could have the roving microphones and people could just wait for the microphone before they... This chap here.
I'm Nicholas Falk from Urbed. I'm sure Anne would get our votes, and I'm sure she's got 4/5 of the answers. But there is an issue about building more homes, if only to improve the choice, and which would include enabling older people to move into apartments rather than living in isolated villages. And it seems to me that this issue of land, which Charles Goodhart referred to, is absolutely fundamental to whether we crack the problems, and particularly tapping land value uplift to plough back in infrastructure. So I'd be interested in your views about whether it is possible to get consensus on being able to appropriate land at close to its existing use value, which there are suggestions that all the political parties might sign up to. Lord Matthew Taylor has just come out with a report advocating garden villages, which I'm sure Anne is going to hate because they're built in the green fields. But the idea is that the land is taken at its close to its existing use value in return for no development where people don't want it. And so I'm just wondering whether it's about time to think that we might actually get a consensus on this crucial issue of getting hold of the land and following what other European countries do, rather than thinking we can live in a sort of free market world of our own.
Well, Christine and I were both at a panel yesterday where the question of land value taxation became not quite a punch-up, but certainly it was the most passionately contested issue in the room. So would anybody like to not have a punch-up, but politely contest on this issue? Charles?
Well, the value of a house in a nice part of an urban centre is almost entirely land. And people talk about housing being unaffordable. And basically the technology of building a house is fairly straightforward and actually hasn't changed very much for 100 years. What has been changing is that the people all want to live together. And so you get the massively expensive housing in the prime areas, notably in London. And that's why I'm not terribly sort of moved by the arguments about Australia and the United States, because people don't want to live in Minnesota. They want to live in New York or Washington or Boston. And therefore I do feel that fundamentally the housing problem does tend to come back to the problem of land use and the question of its taxation, because land is there without anyone doing anything. It's not as if I've improved the land. Sometimes one does a bit in one's garden, but otherwise. And so, since the land is in a sense the land of the country, why shouldn't the country benefit by taxing the enhanced values?
Christine?
I've just come back from New Zealand. About 80 miles out from the centre of Auckland, I passed a notice saying, "Welcome to the city of Auckland," or rather to the region of Auckland. The house prices in the centre of Auckland, right in the centre, were higher than in London.
Oh my God.
And that is a world where there is almost no constraints on the land system, and not dissimilar to Phoenix. It is frightening but it is real, that what people want to be is near the water or in the centre where everything's going on, and they are prepared to pay very high prices, even if they're not going to live there all of the time, which was the other concern in New Zealand, which was much worse than in London. So I do think that just saying we can get hold of land is not the answer. I agree with Charles that, or maybe part of it, appropriation is sensible in some contexts. It's always going to be difficult. And if Nick said that it would be in exchange for nobody objecting to where it was being put, then sorry, there is nowhere which nobody objects to. So I don't think that will be a process which works. I think one of the things we should recognise is that over the last 20, 30 years, a very large proportion of housing has been built on sites which are in some sense new to housing. They may be very close to other housing, but they aren't just the regeneration of housing of the sort that Anne is talking about. They have been bringing in other land which has been either used for other purposes or has been part of rather inefficient public and other estates. So there is land available and we can put stuff in new sites. I do totally agree with attempting to tax the increase in land value, but I am horribly aware that a large number of countries that used to be good at it are no longer able to do it very effectively.
Anyone else? Nancy, Anne, any thoughts?
Just go with that.
I'm good with land tax.
You're good with land tax.
That's
Land
good.
taxes.
Anne?
We're all for. And
Same.
council
Yep.
taxes, by the way. That's a support to Anne on that.
Okay.
Council tax bans is the right way forward.
So I think there's a lady in a blue top back there. I think it's a Sikh throwback. If you could...
You do
You mean
because
because it's recorded for the video, I'm afraid. Sorry. If somebody...
I speak very loudly. My name's Lisa Mackenzie. I'm a fellow in the Department of Sociology here, but I'm also an housing activist. And I've worked with New Era, our West Hendon, Focus E15, and we are currently occupying the Aylesbury estate. And one of the things that none of you have spoke about really is what is happening with social cleansing. And actually, the land is worth more than the people that live on it. And I think actually you've used terms like homes, houses and property interchangeably. But actually that's not, that's one of the problems. Is when we did the March for Homes a few weeks ago, we were marching for homes, not houses, not property, not units, actual homes. And I think what Anne sort of really hit it with the wall of money. Because when you've got land that is actually seemed to be worth more than actual people that live on it, we've got serious problems. And I don't work with people that can afford a £450,000 affordable flat. I'm working with people who can't afford, can hardly afford the social housing they live in, and they are being moved out and moved out and moved out. And I could tell you some horrendous stories about mothers and children who are being put literally on the streets because they are just not worth it. And actually none of you spoke about that.
And this is a very good point, I think, is that what we've seen in the last couple of decades or so, arguably since house prices really started to rise in the early 90s, is that housing has not, as you say, become just shelter. It has also become an investable asset class, which is seeing increasing levels of international capital, as Anne, I think, touched on, flowing into it. And that is creating a significant tension economically, which Charles may comment on, and maybe Christine as well, about housing as a consumption good, i.e. a place to live, versus housing as an asset class, i.e. an investment to generate a return, and where does that return come from, and how sustainable is that for the people who are generating that return for the investor. Does anybody want to comment on that?
I think you're exactly right. And actually I didn't say home, and I should have said home. I think
you did say home.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I can also sing the red flag later if you like, but maybe privately.
I'm not coming in.
No, well, probably the same parties, but, different things. I do think that we need to think about homes. One of the reasons that I talked a little bit about the state building and when the state built after the war is that we had a very different attitude towards society. We had a very different attitude towards what it meant to build for people. We had an idea about community in a different sort of way and collectivity in a different sort of way. We've shifted that now, and I think that's a great pity. I don't personally know how to shift it back. If I did, I would. But I certainly take your point, and I am with you on that.
Anyone else? Charles?
Well, it's obviously a huge issue how people are treated, both, in terms of actually getting into housing at all, finding anywhere to live, but also much more importantly, when they're living somewhere, how where they live is treated as land, as buildings, and as people. So a lot of the development that goes on in London at the moment is, as I think it was Charles who talked about, the huge land value in London compared with the value of the actual house. Well, you compare the combination of the value of the land and the value of the house with the value of people who are earning either very little or not earning at all, and who are therefore seen as a charge on the state, and what the current attitude is about that conundrum. And decisions are made without actually factoring in any human costs or any human potential. So if we assume that everybody who's able-bodied and of working age is potentially a worker, and if we assume that wages should actually represent what people can actually do to pay their way in order to live, then the current system that we've got, where we pay people way below their ability to actually pay for things that would count as basic survival, like housing, then we've created a huge employment problem as well as a huge housing problem. And we've just done very big survey of welfare reform right across the southwest of the country. We did a big survey of debt and financial resilience in Newham, which is the poorest London borough. And, you know, from these two opposite perspectives, the southwest, which goes from Cornwall to the city of Bath, and Newham, which is, as people probably know, deep into East London, you face the same sort of problems at the bottom: too low wages, too expensive housing, and really a huge reliance in both cases on social housing. If there wasn't social housing in both those places, I don't know where people would be. So you know, it does take me back to thinking that I don't want to sound like an advocate for only social housing, because I'm certainly not that. I'm in favour of owner-occupation, I'm in favour of private renting, and I think social housing is very important. But if we don't respect the value of people along with the value of land and the value of housing, and if we don't see cheap housing that we've already built as one of the ways of helping the problem we've got of affordability, then I think we're crazy. So if we think just in economic terms, to have cheap housing for low-income people so that they can actually afford where they live must make sense. We are really not being very economically thoughtful if we think that it's a dispendable asset just because of the land value that a developer can then use to produce housing that people won't be able to live in.
Christine?
The difficulty, I think, I'm going to speak about what reality might be as opposed to where I personally would be in this context. I think there's an enormous story around maintaining security, maintaining the home in the way that you're talking about. There's also an enormous story around insiders and outsiders. Mm-hmm. And in some perceptions, the people you're talking about are the insiders who happen to be at the margin who are getting affected. But there's the outsiders who aren't able to get in at all, or really are in extreme difficulties. Now, what I want to say is something which I think is not what is being said at the present time. There is enormous cross-party agreement about housing. It isn't an area where there is vast disagreement. And it is not the case, I'm afraid, that on the left you will get security and low rents, and on the right you will get insecurity and high rents. In both cases, both parties who are likely to be in power have been reducing security in the social rented sector and will continue to reduce security in the social rented sector. And there is this pressure to try to increase security in the private rented sector, but it'll be very marginal, whatever is done in this context. So I'm afraid I think this is an outsider's argument. You're going to have to go on pushing, and we will support you in going on pushing, because it is right and proper that that sort of feeling is there. But the other point I would like to make in this context is that what we're talking about is because there is not other land available. Now, my argument, in part, not entirely by the way, because I think there is a pure social wish to do things which are different and unpleasant. I think the fact that much of the housing has been on, in some strict sense, new land, but usually within urban areas, is important in this context. But I honestly don't think that you can hold that all green belt is sacred at the same time as holding that you're going to protect everybody within the current system. Now, I don't want to go against the green belt overall, but I do want to go for trade-offs between areas which are high value for everybody. So accessibility to jobs, including social housing as part of the planning gain, etc., in areas where it is very clear to most people that the value is not high as compared to the housing value, as long as we absolutely maintain the elements of the green belt. And we're talking about, we're going to be talking about 95% of it. We're not talking about losing vast quantities. And I think the problem about the green belt is that there are a very large number of people who believe that if you lose 1 hectare, you're going to lose the 100 million hectares or whatever is the number, you know what the number is, which is actually in place. If we could show that that was not the case, I think we could find places which we could build which would give accessible, reasonable standard social housing out of the planning game which is involved in it.
Charles, from your perspective, do you think it's a worry that housing has become this kind of fetishised asset class as opposed to an economic consumption good, which arguably it's what it should be seen as?
I don't think that outside of London there are many people who buy a house, and there are people who do buy for letting and buy to let. But they're helping to add to the supply of housing, and I don't see that's a bad thing. And in London, yes, there are some. I think that it's been exaggerated, the number of sort of Russian billionaires who sort of buy a house in London as a sort of safety valve in case Putin decides to shoot at them. I don't think outside of London that it's a particular problem. And I think outside of London, this business of the wall of money just isn't true.
But what about inside London? And what
well,
London
is a very special case. Fortunately, we've got Tony here to talk to explain how London is a special case and what ought to be done about it. But there are lots of areas which could be improved. I know, since my son is a QPR supporter, and there's the whole of the Old Oak Common area, which again, there's one of the problems on that is the planning conflict between the various people involved. But there are various brownfield sites in London that could be extended and improved and developed. Places like Old Oak Common. The amount of land that the present railroads have, which they don't actually use, as far as I can see, very efficiently, and quite a lot of that could be made available.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, shall we throw it out? There's a gentleman back there in a dark blue shirt near the back corner. If we could pass along to him. Yeah. Okay. I think we'll take 2 or 3 points at once. So we'll take that gentleman, then we'll take this gentleman in the pale blue shirt in the middle.
Yeah. Ed Clark, Centre for Cities. I'm just sort of wondering what you guys think about some of the geography of these things. So we talked a lot about the fact that the nation needs X amount of homes, depending what sort of political party you're talking from. But I think not only are we not building enough homes, we're not building them in the right places. So if we look at last 10 years, then Burnley and Wigan have actually built more per head than London or Oxford. And that kind of perversion of the geography of the matter, I think, is quite interesting as well. And I think that, again, has a sort of national impact because obviously these are the most productive places in the country and these are the most successful cities. And so it has the sort of the impact of pricing people out of the opportunity, but also on the economy because businesses are constrained. So yeah, I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts.
Okay. There's a chap here. Yes, you sir, with if you could pass the microphone to him.
If we were looking back 25 years ago and we looked at which is when basically private sector rents were deregulated, and we compare the flow of housing benefit now that is spent now of the order of 20 billion a year, excluding council, social rented HP. And we compared to then, which was basically a couple of billion a year, and we look at what's happened to supply, it's an appalling situation whereby we have ratcheted up the amount that we pour into housing benefit and we've got virtually no supply. Was that predicted 25 years ago? I don't think so. And so what has happened is prices have rocketed. Partly that's due to very poor productivity in the UK construction industry. Not time to go into that, but if you compare it to Scandinavia, it is an appalling productivity situation. And which is important in prices. In London, it's less important because it is land values. We have got to ratchet down land values. There is no other way of doing that. There are things that can be done about London. You can follow the Singapore solution to stop the wall of money that is coming into London and stopping the turnover, the sort of high rate of turnover. That's important. But I agree that London is not it is not the UK. But the figure of 20 billion on housing benefit is not just being spent in London. And I think also I would be more pessimistic about some of the things that are happening. If you take housing associations, they are very happily advertising and letting larger family dwellings at rent levels which will exceed for 3 and 4 bedroom households the sort of benefit cap. They're ignoring the benefit cap. So I think that we need to control the sort of land values. I wonder whether the example of Holland, which did produce a reduction in sort of own occupation prices over a sustained period, may sort of hold some lessons here. But unless we not just stabilize but reduce land prices, we are never going to deal with the situation that Anne has talked about, whereby basically low-income people are being squeezed out. If one takes about regeneration, the GLA report, which came out recently, showed that there are 8,000 less social rented dwellings out of a programme of 30,000 at a time when density on those estates is being doubled. So basically you're having an extra 30,000 homes and you're having 8,000 less social rented. That shows that the concern is not for the low income people. I think that we need to be, I think also in the own occupation world, in a situation where we are worried about financial instability, to be reliant on variable interest rate mortgages is very foolish. The French are much better at having fixed interest rate mortgages. The UK has one of the highest levels of personal debt as a percentage of private household income in Europe, far higher as a percentage than public sector, more than double it, and it's rising. And part of the problem, a big part of the problem, is own occupation. We need, and basically what people have to borrow because of the very high prices. I think that any solution which does not reduce prices over time will fail.
Okay, thank you very much. If we could have maybe say one more question. I think there's a gentleman just down here on the edge, about kind of middle of the row back, wearing a dark blue jumper. If we take that one, and then we'll take some panel responses, and then maybe we'll come to Tony.
Thank you. Duncan Bower, University of Westminster. I think Christine's entirely right by saying there's very little distinction between the policies of the major political parties. And in fact, both the major political parties are locked into an agenda which is focusing on supporting individual asset appreciation, not the effective use of both existing and the new housing stock. And we do need some fundamental changes. I mean, when Nick Falk earlier asked the question about acquisition of land for development, the response focused very much on land value tax, which is actually not the issue. The issue is the way in which we actually get land into some form of public and collective ownership, and without at minimal cost, as Peter Kane's just been referring to, and without a mechanism by which local authorities can actually zone sites primarily for social rented housing, and I stress social rented housing, not marginally sub-market housing, and actually compulsorily acquire those sites at existing use value, including in appropriate circumstances, sustainable developments which may be in land designated as the green belt, where that can actually produce the appropriate housing. Unless we can intervene in that way, that we are not actually going to challenge the fundamental issues of shortage and unaffordability of housing in the southeast of the country especially, but also in other locations. And that is not just about acquiring land for development, it's actually also about acquiring property, existing property development, including poorly managed private rented accommodation, to get the rents down and also to reduce therefore the dependency on housing benefit. That is the only cost-effective way in which we can actually deal with the fundamental problems of housing. The issues are ones of ownership and control, and actually ensuring the effective use of both the existing stock and the development capacity to meet the needs of London and the broader southeast and the rest of the country. And it's an economic issue as well as a housing issue and a quality of life and social justice issue. Thank you.
Okay, so quite a wide variety of different points having been made there. Now, panel, who would like to pick up on any of those? Charles, are there any points there?
The only one that I would like to take up is a suggestion that we ought to go to a fixed long-term mortgage. I'm not in favour of that. I think that the variable rate mortgage has a very considerable advantage because it gives you a hedge against the kind of swings in economic conditions. And in particular, when we got into serious trouble with the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, interest rates rocketed down. That meant that people on a variable rate mortgage were facing far less in the way of outward cash flows than they would have been if they'd stuck themselves on a fixed rate mortgage before. And again, interest rates tend to go up when the economy is doing relatively well and people's real income is tending to rise. So that if you've got a variable rate, it obviously doesn't work for everybody, but as a generality, having a variable rate mortgage gives you a hedge against the kind of cycles in the economic conditions to which all modern economies are prone to. So I would certainly not support a switch away from variable rate to fixed rate. And people, after all, do have a choice. And certainly if I was taking out a mortgage now, I think I would want to take out a fixed rate, because I think interest rates have reached just about an all-time bottom. And to fix an all-time bottom for about 20 years would be extremely nice.
Quite. Anyone else? Yes, Christine.
Two things. One, it is the case that both Labour Party and Conservative Party's policies are based on price rises. And they would be very, very unhappy if price rises didn't continue. Mansion tax would not get in the money you expected, and planning gain would not get in the planning gain that they expected. So I don't like it, but it's true. So I think it's also true that, and the Netherlands is a very, very good example of this, people do not like their house prices going down, and they do show that in voting behaviour. The other point, I think, which is much more important in practical, well, not in practical terms, because politics is important, is that, as somebody was saying, basically what we've seen over the last 15 years is a situation where we have built for the owner-occupied sector and for the social rented sector, and both have declined. So everything's gone into private renting. Private renting of itself is extraordinarily bad at incentivising building. It incentivises living at higher densities, it incentivises using the existing stock better, but it does not generate new build. And that is a really big reason why we're not getting the building rates at the present time, and it's not something I think we're talking about. We're talking about institutional investment in a bit of a private rented sector, 5,000 units a year in London if we're really lucky. This is not the story.
Nancy, much better use of CPO powers, for example. What do you think?
I think much better use of CPO powers could be incredibly helpful. I think, again, that would need to be done in conjunction with the idea that you would be trying to provide affordable homes via doing that. It can't be in any other sort of way. I also would really echo Christine's point about house price rises. I think it's one of the real paradoxes in this situation is that we often talk, and over dinner parties people are very happy to say, oh God, you know, house prices are too high, but actually most people who own would cry if their house prices went down. So the political will of having them go down, considering most of us are homeowners, or a lot of people are homeowners, as Christine was saying, you know, quite lots of us are comfortably housed. It's a real difficulty in terms of politics, because while we might want to see prices come down, politically that would be impossible.
Could I challenge both Christine and you on that one? And if there was a land tax, so that the prices of land came down, as they would if it was taxed, then the return that a builder would make on anything that new land that he bought. And on the existing land banks, they'd make a loss, so they'd be unhappy about that. But any new land that they bought, they'd make exactly the same profit, or a higher profit.
Yeah, no. I'm saying your average individual at a dinner party doesn't want to think that their house price would go down in respect of where it currently is.
And that's true in Scandinavia, it's true in Netherlands and everywhere else. And
Yeah, but you've got to think about the people who haven't yet on the housing.
Oh,
land.
I do. No,
And
I vote. Listen,
Yeah,
they should vote.
But there are lots of people between 21 and 40 who are not able to get into a house, and they would be very happy with lower housing prices.
Absolutely.
And and when you look at the sort of the overall wealth effect, if you're worried about your own children, you ought to be. And it's a wash. The children are better off. You're worse off.
Charles, I hate to say it, but I will. Economists attempt to be rational about a lot of things, and this is an irrational response on the part of people, but I'm afraid people are irrational and they care about their house price.
Yeah.
And they look it up. They look it up once a week.
Right.
But if all people were taxed on their house values, they would surely start moving to a more manageable house. And therefore houses will be opened up for younger families, which are currently under occupied.
But it's much more to it than just prices.
People also are not they, they're not they, they're us.
Well, us, we will.
Anne, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a few points that have come up that I have thoughts on. So somebody at the very beginning talked about building houses in the right places. I noticed with Charles' articles about Help to Buy that he was very pleased with the fact that a lot of the Help to Buy had operated in northern parts, and to the extent that that was encouraging new build in places where there's already too much housing, it would be a very bad thing. We have this crazy idea that we have to have regional equity in housing regardless of where it's most necessary, and it is a lot more expensive to produce housing in London or the southeast or in any high demand area than it is in Burnley or Wigan. So Burnley has emptied its centre out, literally emptied its centre out, by building all around it with cheap money and with cheap housing association build. So that's a crazy idea, and I was very alarmed when I read Charles. I don't know whether that was the meaning of what you wrote, Charles, so maybe we could have a quick word afterwards for me to check my facts. Secondly, the private rented sector deregulation has at least done one thing, which it has put private renters on the map. We did need private renting to be on the map. And actually, just as a matter of fact, we have added about 3.7 million homes since the 25-year timeline when private renting was introduced. So it's not true that we've produced no housing. We've produced a very large amount of housing. It might not be enough, but it's a lot of housing. And just to make an extra point on that, the fact that private renting increases sharing and increases density has to be a good thing when the huge rate of household formation is among single people who literally under any scenario can't afford to, and it wouldn't be suitable for them to actually own and buy on their own at different points in their lives. So actually we have to think of the private rented sector a bit more in the round, I think. On the Dutch model, I'll only say, having studied the Dutch model, Holland does have this very big advantage, or huge, unbelievably huge disadvantage, of being 70% underwater. And so they have to have 365 days a year, 24-hour a day pumping of their land all over the country. So naturally they have this unbelievably powerful land ownership, land control, government bit that dictates absolutely everything. And when I was on the Urban Task Force with Richard Rogers, it was the absolute envy of the task force that the Dutch system worked that way. But having actually visited Holland and looked, stood on a dike, it's just horrible to see the land, 6 meters below the sea. It's really not a very good model after all. And why we should sustain the green belt. The green belt is one simple popular control over the wrong side of development that actually protects our cities from knocking into each other and actually protects our environment. And I would like secretly to agree with Christine that you can snick away in all sorts of little ways, which happens all the time anyway, but to keep the principle of the green belt in place is absolutely vital to our country's future. It is the envy of the world. Every European country and every developing country loves the fact that we've got green belts that we actually sort of enforce. And we would be absolutely crazy in an island with no more land out there to actually get, and with actually bits of our cliffs falling off already, to think anything otherwise. And so, given the infill capacity in London alone, that's actually been proved and demonstrated many times over by the London boroughs, including the London borough that I live in, it's absolutely insane to talk like this when we're not actually valuing those infill sites. So one thing I would have loved both Tars and Christine to talk about is how we could actually incentivise more the kind of smaller scale infill tap building. When I say smaller, I mean like, 10, 20 to maybe 100 homes that will fit on a 1 hectare site and up to a 1 hectare site, starting from half an acre, because we could actually do everything that London needs for a long time into the future, given the flow of infill sites, if that was what we incentivise. So that would be my last bit of government action. It won't win me the election, though.
I think you already read it. Tony, Travers, did you want to say anything?
Well,
if we've got, we have the.
I want to return to the question of taxation. And there are very, very good arguments for improving the taxation of property. There are good reasons, because the current arrangements are bad in terms of operating taxes, and they are out of date, and they are having a random at best impact on the complex property market we've just been discussing. So it says everybody can sign up to that except anybody who gets into government. And they all see this in terms of crude losers and gainers, but they don't care about the gainers, it's the losers they think about. So any reform to the existing property tax, even revaluation, even slightly adding some extra bands, and certainly a land value tax would, I'm assuming, absolutely spook all politicians who get into government. So what advice could you give them that it'll be all right after all?
Go to Denmark and look at what happens.
No, it's the change, Nick. It's the change. It's not the rationality of the system you get to. It's the process of moving there that they're worried about. You could have the world's best system sanctified by the UN, and it would still, or any other organisation you like, if you do, but it would still, the process of getting there wouldn't pass muster. It's the agony of moving. They remember Mrs. Thatcher and the poll tax.
But that's true of almost all sort of major moves in this direction. It's sort of the problem of politics. The losers don't forgive you, and the gainers just take it for granted. And that makes it extraordinarily difficult to change from wherever you are, even if it is sensible and rational to make that change. And that is a hideous problem, and it doesn't matter who's going to get in power. They will all face that particular problem. And it's always a difficulty.
But when they face it, they just don't do anything, and that means that the tax. And I'm not having a go at you. I mean, I'm just to the panel, but it's such a bad. I'm getting at politicians. It's such a poor piece of tax administration that, and of course, it's precisely because it's visible and would have the effects on property that everybody's talking about that it can't be done. That's the perverse paradox.
Nor could mortgage tax relief be done, but it was. It did take 30 years, but it was done, and it's one reason why, oddly enough, the British system is working better than the Dutch system, where you've still got marginal tax for existing owners, you've still got tax relief at the marginal rate and the highest rated debt in Europe.
Indeed. And in Sweden too. The household debt to income ratio is a lot worse in some other countries where mortgage interest is tax deductible. Where it's not here, which is, as Christine says, we've done something.
We did it by changing its name. Let's change the name of everything we don't like.
Yeah. I mean, I see Tony's point, and I've actually had discussions with him about this problem, and it is true that politicians keep chickening out on it. But, I mean, there are certain things that are driven by imperatives. So London managed to vote for a congestion charge against all the odds because we were stuck on traffic, and it did it by doing partly a massive campaign, but mainly by actually finding out what the actual cost was of not doing it, and by proving that again and again and again. And if we could prove what the huge cost in terms of foreign speculative buying, under occupation, rate of second homes, reduction in density, isolated elderly in too big flats, young people not able to access anything, and. You know, we could really string together an unbelievably powerful argument. One of the reasons why the London congestion charge worked was because it was for London. And I don't know if this is a crazy suggestion, but property taxes are local. If we gave the mayor the power to actually deal with this problem of property values and property taxes in London, and we actually penalised him in every other way, so he had to do it because otherwise he wouldn't have a budget, I reckon, you know, that he would find a way, and that would pave the way. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that in Wales they've done it, and in Ireland they've done it. And they didn't do it exactly by stealth, but they did it rather quietly, and nobody caused a fuss. And it's not that there are no rich people in Wales. So, I mean, there aren't as many as maybe in London, but there are some. And so they've done it, and by pushing up the bands. So I think there are sort of sneaky ways of actually getting it into people's mind that this is a ridiculous situation. And the third thing is, we did it with second homes, and there were huge arguments against doing it with second homes, and we've done it with second homes, and we've now given councils like Kensington, which has the highest rate of second home ownership in the whole flipping country, you know, the power to actually go even way over that. And if they don't do that, then their budget is bust. So I think there are ways of sneaking it through, and I think you're far too pessimistic, Tony, about this, and you're far too influential. You talk far too often to The Economist, and for you to be so weak-kneed about it is wrong.
Courage.
Unless he should be taking a lead on this whole
Absolutely.
Okay, we're pretty much over time, so unless anyone has any absolutely desperate points that they really have to say right now, I think we're going to wrap up. So could you all join me in thanking our panel, please?